Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Wistrand, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of the recently published book, The Post-Soviet Human: Philosophical Reflections on Social History After the End of Communism. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to remind you that you can stay up to date on the Kennan Institute's activities by visiting the Kennan Institute's website and subscribing to our blogs and podcasts. Additionally, I'd like to encourage you to view the Kennan Institute's 50th anniversary, which is also on our website. 50th anniversary timeline, which is on our website. So we are very honored today to have our guest, Dr. Mykhailo Minakov. Dr. Minakov is a senior advisor with the Kennan Institute and the editor-in-chief of the Kennan Institute's Focus Ukraine blog. Dr. Minakov is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Ideology and Politics, as well as the author of numerous academic articles and book chapters. After our guest speaks, there will be a question and answer period. For our online audience, you can submit your questions in one of three ways. So by email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via X to @KennanInstitute, or on our Facebook page as a message. And then for our in-person audience, please, when you ask a question, you've got a microphone in front of you, or if you don't, please ask your neighbor for one and just remember to push the button on and off. And for both our in-person and online audience, please remember to introduce yourself, give your name and your affiliation. Finally, today's discussion is being recorded. So with that, Misha, please.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and showing interest in this book. I can show it. It's not really a thick one. We can push it around. For me, it's quite unusual as a philosopher from Eastern Europe. You are kind of expected to produce big volumes, not something short. However, I did my best to bring together philosophy, history, well, contemporary history, and political science together. There's a buzzword, interdisciplinarity. Here I tried to make it co-disciplinarity that would help us understand who were these post-Soviet humans. And I tried to do it in several ways, like looking at the human existence, how it's been constructed, conditioned by living in post-Soviet world, what happened with our imagination in political science, in political philosophy, how did we imagine these times, what was the language applied to how we understood it. And then finally, what were the achievements? And this was something like I proposed to do, like a balance sheet, accountant way, democratic achievements and autocratic achievements from these 3 decades. So basically the book was published this year. In Ukrainian it was published in January. In Russian it was, first edition was published in April, and then I rewrote because there was a strong reaction from Russian reading emigration, and I added something. Second edition, and English edition was published in July. Well, it's published in a specific, and I recommend you to follow this series, Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society, at Ibidem Verlag. It's a German publisher that is connected to the Columbia University Press. And I think today it's the most interesting academic series on the recent 100 years in Eastern Europe and Northern Eurasia. This is really amazing how Andreas Umland, who is editor of this series, brought together different authors from different countries in different languages, mainly English, German, and Russian. And it's really a wealth of knowledge in different disciplines. So I recommend you to look at it. But also with this Ibidem Verlag, Kennan Institute worked on a very specific project. Since it was published before the war, kind of everything that was before the war is forgotten. But for quite a long time, together Ukrainian and Western scholars wrote a sort of textbook for English-speaking universities about history of contemporary Ukraine. So we have 9 chapters there, each written by a couple or more Ukrainian and Western scholars, about politics, about society, how Ukrainians invented richness and poverty, or how did we invent our identities, or what was happening with our religious life, or what was happening with our democracy. Matt Rajansky and I wrote this chapter. So that I really recommend to look back at this book, although it's outdated, it doesn't cover like the major invasion. Or in this series, I was editor of several volumes. For example, what was happening with philosophy in post-Soviet countries. So communism falls. Philosophy is not important anymore. What's going on with it? And it's really a detective story in each national case. In Lithuania, it's very interesting. In Russia, it's very vibrant. In Ukraine, it was so vivid. So in this book, you can get some information about these processes. Or invisible nation-making, this post-Soviet secessionisms. So what was happening with non-recognized territories, groups, statelets? It was also there, and I was privileged to edit it together with 2 colleagues. And again, and with variety of researchers from different countries and different schools of studying de facto states. And again, it's just 2 examples. In reality, the series is much, much richer. Well, this book was made due to support of the Vienna-based Institute for Human Sciences. I was writing the book there. But it was also connected to 6 years of constant debates with Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, and German liberals in the School of Civic Education led by Lena Neverovska. And it's also, in a way, a response to these discussions that we had there. And of course, I'm indebted to Will Pomerantz, to Isabella, and to Marjorie Panel, who helped me make this text readable. And Marjorie, who should have been today, but she had to leave earlier, she really kicked me and forced me to write comprehensibly, not only in terms of English, but also in terms of normal language, non-philosophical. It was a challenge for me. So in a way, if I may, I just lead you through the book, through the structure, and that's basically it. So it has just 4 parts. One is what are those concepts that I apply for the post-Soviet history. Then the material history, what would Hegel say? What was developing really in these 30 years? And again, since the start of the nation building, we usually look through the prism of nations to the history of this region. I tried to look at the rhythm of this history in between, in transnational way, let's put it this way. Then the evolution of our perceptions, of our imagination of post-Soviet development. So which ideas, visions, symbols did we apply, and how it developed. And finally, these achievements of this post-Soviet creativity. And it's basically, for me, I was puzzled. So in a way, 1991 is the freest time of my life that I experienced. Of course, I was 20 years old. Of course, it's freest. But it was also for all the collectivities that I saw. We see the political revolutions, we see criminal revolution, we see revolution in banking, in entrepreneurship, everywhere. Also in intimate life, the sexual revolution that starts with late perestroika was a very important part from what happened to us, Ukrainians, Moldovans, Lithuanians, you name it. It was very important to rediscover, after this long term of Soviet conservatism, rediscover the body. or the sexuality or the intimacy. That was a very interesting period in this stuff. And then we see that the result of this development is very meager. And new conservatism, new illiberalism, betrayal of freedom. So how did it happen? We had such a promising beginning and such a dark end. So I tried to answer it the way I could. So I start with this ontological and existentialist argument that human being is present in the world in many different ways. We are thrown into the historical situation, but we are also active participant of this situation. So we are thrown, but we also change it. We are creative forces in this life. So we can look at history, at historical periods, by measuring this creativity. Yes, passivity can be measured as well. It's just the achievements wouldn't be there. And if we look at creative part of human being, then it comes something that we can measure. We can say something what was achieved. Then when we talk about post-Soviet, it immediately provokes people to have these psychological, resentimental reactions. Oh, why again Soviet and Soviet? But in my theory of post-Soviet period, I try to defend the term, saying that in a way, post-Soviet humans tried to self-overcome Sovietness in themselves. So they're constantly fighting with the Soviet legacy in themselves, especially in the early 90s, but also for the next 2 decades as well. So here we are looking at specific self-overcoming, Nietzschean, but also non-Nietzschean way. And here we have nationalisms, here we have neoliberalisms, and different types of practices connected to ideas, but also trying to, okay, you were a passive Soviet citizen expecting benefits from your government, and suddenly you start making your company. Or, for example, in my village, my mother's colleagues, 2 ladies, teachers, who dropped their posts of teaching in 1992, and they become shuttle traders. So with almost no experience going outside of Soviet Union, they go to Turkey, to the markets of Istanbul. They bring big sacks of dresses, cheap dresses, they sell them, and they become self-made women. They saved their families, they fed their kids, they kind of forced their men not to drink anymore. Well, that's how you suddenly see how creativity is not an empty philosophical term. It's something that you can touch, you can see examples and life trajectories. But again, speaking from philosophical point of view, the concept of post-Soviet period is connected with 4 major trends: democratization, marketization, nationalization, and Europeanization. In the first case, we're talking about really inventing free politics, ideological pluralism, new parties, elections, and divided power. So for a long time, Eastern Europe, Northern Eurasia developed in political systems with the idea, it's a very Enlightenment idea of supreme power, absolute monarchy. And it was success, total success in these terms. So this idea found in Russian Empire and then in Soviet Union, something very visible as a practice and as a repeating pattern in political culture. Here is Will Pomeranz, who was writing from his side on this phenomenon as well many times, and I continued his thinking in this book. So we look at democratization in these terms, then marketization. From autarkic economy with planned administrative economy from within, we end up with very open economies, which are based mainly on entrepreneurial skills of different people. And here again, something unusual. For example, I have a good friend, Pan Yuri, who was sent to DC in 1992 for 2 months to learn fast how to create financial system, that vibrant financial system. And he was sent in a country without central bank. So later he becomes a very important part of Ukrainian National Bank starting this. But again, you see how it works. You try to find some models, but then after all you invent. And these people invented financial system, capitalist financial system out of nothing, from mere imagination of how does it work in the West. Unlike in Russia at least, there was these 6 managers who were exposed to foreign trade outside of Soviet Union, like Gerashenko, for example, you know his name. And then they return and they start. So they knew what they were doing in Ukraine or in Lithuania or in Kazakhstan. It was really invention out of pure imagination. So Sophie Lamborghini defended her doctoral dissertation, I think in Humboldt Universitet, on these late Soviet bankers who became creators of Russian banking system. Nationalization. So democracy and market should have some real basis, some fundament. And nations, new nations, were imagined as this ground on which democracy and market will be based. So this nationalism of early 90s, it was actually democratic nationalism. It was connected to the idea of democracy and also Europeanization that was expected to harmonize nationalist deviations. So we have these 3 layers: democracy, market, and nation state, and then Europeanization as something that could keep together this growing region and also spread the same norms, political practices. This is why elections were always monitored by also Council of Europe. All the constitutions had norms supported by Council of Europe. So Council of Europe was critically important in this process. But again, I already mentioned Hegel. If we mentioned him once, he will repeat appearing here. So dialectics. All these trends had other sides. And in reality, democratization immediately meets up with autocratization. You have a shock, you have political shock, you have first elections, and these elections can bring dictators in power, as in Belarus. So it was, you remember there were articles, the last dictatorship of Europe. No, it was the first dictatorship of Europe in a certain new period. And he was inventing many institutions and practices that were repeated in Ukraine, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, in Hungary, you name it. Then marketization, this wild capitalism that we have, it produced oligarchization, monopolies, and grand corruption. That's also this other side of this neoliberal model. Or nationalization. It came, the moment came when nationalism departed democracy, and this illiberal nationalism comes in picture, or like in Russian case, but in some other cases when nationalism comes up with imperialism, and it's also interesting ideological phenomenon that demands special attention. Europeanization. There's a wonderful book written several years ago by Richard Youngs. Here I will just repeat that Europeanization, in the beginning, it was like creation one big Europe from Dublin to Vladivostok with a common set of norms, practices of freedom, of common rhythm, of common, well, political cultures will be probably different. They are conservative, they're slow to change, but they would have some common traits and basic norms, at least in constitutions. And then we see that Europeanization comes up as a geopolitical project, as economic project, and we see that EU can support not necessarily democratic parties or leaders. And this is something that also changed the idea of Europe. So from internal reconstruction into free politics, being pro-European, it means already a geopolitical choice. And it's a different story. It's a different type of Europe and Europeanization. And it comes with the militarist spirit, which splits the continent. So today we have smaller Europe and greater Eurasia, and these North Korean guys in Kursk is another small example of this greater Eurasia. Well, when we talk about material history, I divide it into 5 periods. You can look in the book at it, but I show that during this material period, well, in this material trade niveau, here you see how a number of internal conflicts are growing, social, political, and at a certain moment they become international, not intranational. The first big constitutive moment for this was the wave of color revolutions, when basically post-Soviet countries, which were still very kind of alike, they start dividing into revolutionary and counter-revolutionary. And counter-revolutionaries promote this paranoid idea of Western influence on it. There was influence, let's face it, but the major cause of these revolutions are internal and they are not tackled. And in the end, it leads to the period of wars. And in this Russian invasion of Ukraine, the post-Soviet period ends. But when we scholars were working with the post-Soviet history, social processes, economy, legal processes, we basically worked in 3 different eras. First was Great Expectations. You mentioned Havel today. Yeah, Havel was, the spirit of Havel was critically important to understand what is post-communism. He and many left European thinkers promoted the idea that there is a possibility to create this big Europe. If you look at the Charter of Paris of 1990, that's a sketch, a project of this one big Europe. Freedom, free nations living together in harmonical space of cooperation and trade. And scholars followed this path. And you can see that the idea of deep and comprehensive transformation as post-Soviet or post-communist development was there. But before dying, Havel publishes a short column in The Economist, where he already shows, oh gosh, this post-communist history is so unexpected. It goes in the way we didn't expect it would. And of course, approximately 94, 95, scholars start becoming much more sober. Okay, probably it won't be like huge transformation, but at least some feasible democratization. And already in 2003, Thomas Carothers publishes his famous critical article about this transformation transit theory and criticizes it. It's about this period. But then color revolutions come and kind of political scholars, political philosophers, historians are back into this mood. Oh, probably this time we'll make it better. But quite soon, in 2 years, 3 years, you see publications of academicians become very realistic, not only pessimistic, realistic. And here we see this period when questioning of the post-Soviet progress starts. And quite soon we will see the theories of look-and-way electoral autocracy, then patronal politics of Henry Hale from George Washington University, mafia state model of Balint Magyar, and so on and so on. So we basically start looking at post-Soviet countries without pink glasses. That's interesting how this new theory, the patronal politics model, works so well even today. So in order to understand how these wars are organized, how ministries of defense are organized, or how strategic corruption is organized, it's already can be discussed and researched using the patronal politics model. So something realistic approach to studying post-Soviet societies. And I'll finish with these two sets of achievements, democratic and autocratic. So if we are indeed creative creatures, and collective creativity leads to certain achievements, institutions, first of all, we can measure them. So again, Hegel, objectivations of human or subject. So what are those subjectivations? And again, here I use just two categories. I'm sure we can use much more. In terms of democracy, new states with separate branches of government. So this one big supreme power is cut in pieces. Wonderful. And it's in constitutions, but it's also in practices. Judges, even in the most corrupt countries or in most authoritarian countries, still are, in a way, more autonomous. Political and legal systems are based on the rule of law. At least they tried, let's put it this way. And this positive law is still dominating. And again, before the war, in the Ideology and Politics journal, we published a special issue of key legal thinkers about this path that post-Soviet countries went in 30 years in terms of rule of law. And the common denominator, yes, we tried, yes, we failed. Then multi-party systems with ideological pluralism, they worked and they still exist, although already not probably that they're not that effective political organization, so their competition does not produce enough political liberties. And there were period of free media and powerful civil society. And it's interesting that free media and powerful civil society today can contradict each other. Many strong civil society organizations, from defenders of media freedoms, can become censors. If you enter the period of wars, everything is possible. And also civil society organizations can promote ethno-nationalism, imperialism, certain ideologies without having any checks and balances, without going through elections and so on. So really unexpected results. Again, in Prague, there should have been an event dedicated to Gellner. And Gellner was really a brain behind the idea that civil society can be a decisive element in future post-Soviet, post-communist democratization, because they would at least provide pluralism. But it doesn't look like it worked, at least from the perspective of 2020s, maybe in the future. Well, it's measurable, so in this chapter in the books I use measurements and some graphs. For example, the reality of division of power index. If we take 4 cases, like Estonia as the ideal case with the strongest influence of European or wider Western institutional and normative culture, there it's stably high. But then we have deviative paths of Russia, where democratization was and then stopped, and there's a long history of autocratic development, or There's Ukraine, where we have several waves of democratization and autocratization, and Uzbekistan, where after several months of change, and one long line of autocratic life. Or we can look at rule of law index, again, varieties of democracies, has a good database. And here it's the comparative comparison of these 4 cases, which represent the entire post-Soviet. Well, de facto states would have a little bit different story here, but out of all recognized states, we can have these 4 categories where you have Estonia, after short-living deviations, a quest for institutions, basically from 93 on, you have strong electoral democracy, so elections work and they really show the preference of the voters. Then you have strong liberal component when law limits the majority and limits the government, and then the deliberation, this third line in these graphs. So everywhere you can see that electoral democracy had biggest success, even in Uzbekistani case, so in this case that represents this type of states, even their elections have some meaning. So ritual, but this ritual is more meaningful for political class than in Soviet times. In Ukraine, of course, you know our story, but even in Russia, these elections play some role in. Yeah, I'm finishing. Autocratic outcomes, when we look at this, then we have a different story. So we divided one supreme power into different institutionalized branches. Okay, so how do we return to one reunited power? Through informal power networks. So patronal politics of Henry Hale, that's the basically idea of returning. Okay, one group, one patronal network will have president in it, then some part of parliament, some judges, some mayors, some military staff, siloviki, and so on. And you have the network that resembles in future. And if this one network takes over the government, it can establish one pyramid rule. But Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, it's multi-pyramid. So you have these power networks. They are very influential. They can subdue entire branches of power, but at the same time, they compete with each other, which produces rooms of freedom for citizens, for media, for civil society. Then post-Soviet presidentialism is something that it starts with Gorbachev, who creates this post to get out of party's control. And in post-Soviet history, it gets a new, vibrant story. It becomes the source of the dangers for democracies, except for, again, 3 countries, Baltic countries, where we have parliamentary systems, and presidentialism is rather limited. Or new ideological monopolies. Post-Soviet period starts with direct prohibitions in many constitutions. No, in Ukrainian, for example, competition, it is prohibited, it is banned to have state ideology. But then somehow during conflicts and wars, you see how we return to this monopoly. And it's a widespread practice now in post-Soviet countries. And it's being reinvented already in the 90s. For example, a group of liberals from Moscow in 1992 go to Pinochet. And they literally talk to him. They were there for 2 weeks. Naishal describes it very well. When they ask him about models, recipes, how to develop Russia. Interesting that it was not even Putinist or before Putinist era. But these questions and these models, okay, we don't have a long history of democracy, maybe we can achieve some rich economy with other ways. Well, it's 1992, it's also there. And of course, wars, reinvention of wars, restart of wars, which produce autocratic trends. That's another autocratic achievement. So I'm finishing basically with the idea that big Europe is changing. It's now becoming the region not from Dublin to Vladivostok, but from Ulster to Magadan. Ulster that represents all these conflicts, religious, ethnic, and Magadan, former capital of Gulag. And this kind of space is really forces us to ask what is the future for Eastern Europe, for Northern Eurasia, and nearby regions. Thank you.
Misha, that was fantastic. And when you said that you have difficulty making things comprehensible, I think you're not being accurate there. I think everyone in here would agree that this was a completely comprehensible lecture from beginning to end. And we're going to start taking questions just to remind our online audience. You've got 3 ways to submit your questions, and please do start sending them in. You can do it by email, kennan@wilsoncenter.org. You can do it via X to @KennanInstitute, or on our Facebook page, you can just leave a message. And then again, for our in-person audience, please speak in a microphone. I will, while people are beginning to send in their questions or think of their questions, I'll start with one question for you. You had so many great lines. I mean, even ending there with Ulster to Magadan. I mean, incredible the way you reconfigured the map. But I want to go to maybe a bigger meta question. You said, I really liked too when you said post-Soviet humans had to self-overcome. And I'm wondering, at what point did that end, or maybe it didn't end? And then I want to ask you about that question about including even post-Soviet. Will there ever be a point at which these populations can abandon that term, or no, do you think it's always going to be a part of their future trajectory?
No, I think it's already abandoned. It's in the past. To overcome Soviet legacy, you needed democracy, you needed market economy, you needed this nationality in democratic meaning, and you needed Europe that spread common norms. And then right now it doesn't really matter. We need security, first of all. And security means a different type of government, a different type of society. So if you listen attentively to the debate in Eastern Europe today, you listen that the ideal model is garrison state. Well, the term comes from Washington, actually. It was born in 1940s, and there were several ideas behind it proposed to American presidents to create a garrison state. But thanks God, there's Constitution in the United States. However, in Eastern Europe right now, there's a big temptation, and the model of Israel is being studied. So some level of democracy, some level of security, garrison state. So far, these garrison states, in our case, are being invented in a different way, with applying imperial, pre-imperial, Soviet models and so on, but definitely not self-overcoming in these terms.
Start with some, please.
Is that hello? Ekaterina Klimenko, I'm a Billington Fellow here at the Kennan Institute. So first of all, thank you very much for this fascinating, though dark picture of the last 30 years of development of the region. But as you were painting this picture, I was thinking of recent developments in France, in Italy, in Great Britain, in Germany, and I'm talking Western Germany. So how specific is this to the region? Because if we're talking about this disillusionment with democracy, with liberal values, the idea of freedom maybe and whatnot, it seems to me that it's not only about Russia, Ukraine, or even Poland or Hungary, but it's kind of a broader trend. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Well, I think we have the common trend, but with different backgrounds and different contexts. So yes, I think Italian case shows a lot of risks turning threats from this kind of prime minister. But again, these threats never came true. Not yet. Not yet. And if you look at the value orientations of the population, it's still not supportive of non-free regimes or far rights. Even far rights, they manipulate and they refer to freedom in Central Europe, in Western Europe. But also, well, in Ukraine, when I talk to sociologists, the pollsters, they say, no, freedom is still, at rhetorics, is still valued. And then when there's certain threats to your family members' limits, definitely in Ukraine you see the value of liberty or the value of freedom. It's there. So in terms of values, I think we are not done, and it's not that dark. However, the practices and the institutions, these inventions that have more influence on constructing the social worlds, they just say, okay, you want freedom, continue wanting, but we will deal with the issue of security. And it's really existential issue, the existential value. So here, I return to my initial statement. We have commonalities, but they, in these different contexts and in different political cultures and systems, they probably are less toxic for Western Europe.
Yeah, I have a question in the same vein of a kind of comparative work. So I know that there is a lot of sort of post-socialist comparisons between Russia and China's trajectory, but one of the more simple explanations I've heard from a layman was, well, first of all, China's kind of development and what they had to overcome was from 1949 onwards, up until 78, 79. For the Soviet Union, this is from 1917. So generationally, you didn't actually have anybody who still remembered what a market economy looked like. And so my question, as it relates to your thesis about sort of the human and creativity, is I mean, in your case, you're talking about somebody who was maybe Homo Sovieticus, having to transform into something else. Whereas I think the creative side, could you talk a little bit more about the human in intergenerational terms and how that impacted
Thank you.
Russia's and the Soviet Union's development versus Chinese?
And what's your name? Sorry, you didn't say.
My name is Jai Zhao, and I'm here at the Kennan Institute.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm currently working on a research. How did we unmake Soviet men, basically, in Ukraine and in Russia? I use two cases right now in my research, in political philosophy and in arts, how we symbolize this disappearance of Soviet, parting with the Soviet past, and disappearing Soviet man. And but at the same time, there's a very solid and interesting research right now that Soviet man means too many different things. So we are talking about historical subjectivities and social practices. So we make, in a way, we make a couple out of Parsons and Michel Foucault, bring together and look back at who was Soviet man. So we all remember Parsonist sociologist Yuri Levada, who came up with the term of anthropo-historical type of Soviet man. So the theory in the late 90s of Levada and his group, that was a common theory, that not only his, that it was generation born between 1918 and 28, I think. I should check. But basically who were born right after the revolution and the civil war, and who during their lifetime through Stalinism and post-Stalinist Soviet Union were bringing certain set of values. And since in the 80s they were becoming retired or senile, they did not influence. A new generation were coming in picture. New generation of leaders like Gorbachev and his entourage were changing politics, international policy, and so on. So this is the period of unmaking of Soviet man. And then in the 90s, at the beginning of 2000, their studies show this anthropological type that was like associated as double thinking, passive, paternalistic type, anthropological type didn't disappear. It remained, it survived the dissolution of Soviet Union, and it stayed in Russia. It's true also for other countries. For a very long time, this type of anthropology can be felt, and during wars it's being reproduced. There's so many Stalinistic symbols, Stalinistic symptoms during the war. If you live in a small community under attacks, then this experience comes back. But at the same time, during Soviet Union, there were also other groups and other types. And when we really bring together Foucault and Parsons, we actually see that during Soviet Union we had at least 4 periods, 4 generations with different types, and respectively different types of politics, of social behavior, and so on, economic inclusion. And when we look at post-Soviet period, the leaders, the most creative personalities were coming from underworld, criminal underworld, or from Academy of Sciences. So sociopaths from unexpected parts of society. So scholars had the privilege of being less ideologically indoctrinated, especially mathematicians, theoretical math. Of course, philosophers were not free, but others were. And if you look at the Forbes list of 2001, first 10 in Russia, 2 come from criminality, 8 come from Academy of Sciences. It's interesting. Very unexpected outcome.
Thank you. I'm going to take, before we go back to the in-person audience, we've got an online question that came from Michael McCormick. What was the role of the West's failure, of the United States and our allies, in facilitating the transition of Russia from the situation in 1991 to a democratic Russia later? It seems as though things went better in places like Poland and the Baltic states, as you mentioned. What can we Americans learn should we get the chance to help again in the future?
Well, I believe in future, as long as humanity exists, there's a chance. As long as West exists, united, there's a chance. But again, looking at this 30 years, Ukraine, for example, was an unwanted child up until very recently. And there was 3 wanted children in Baltic countries. With Russia, different periods. So the Yeltsin's generation, there was a dialogue, Putin's no. for post-Soviet countries, all of them, Kyrgyzstan, even Turkmenistan. I'm saying even because Turkmenistan had this the shortest living period of creativity, let's say, in these terms, democratic creativity. But even there, West is always looked, well, as a sort of threat, but also a source of models for development, of hope, especially for if you're not from the elite group. So there, it was kind of imagined other, the super ego, which we did not have within our own society. So, okay, we kind of, yeah, we have elections, but that we know they were like rigged. Well, but in the West they exist, so probably next time we'll do it better. Since somewhere it exists, we had a source of hope that it will be with us as well. Then there was a Polish example, the success, how West can influence positively us, post-communists, post-Soviets, up until 2015, let's say. Or Hungary, up until 2010. So suddenly you see it's more about us failing rather than West betraying us. I would respond it this way, but again, I think when we talk about the West, there's a real West and there's symbolic West, and this symbolic West is absent superego in our collective selves.
Thank you very much for your illuminating research and presentation. Узнаю руку мастера, because only a true professional can combine Foucault and Parsons, or being a Kantian yourself, I know. I hope it's still true. You can reconcile it with Hegel and Nietzsche. It's truly remarkable. So, being a former student of philosophy department, I'd ask you a philosophical question. So in case of Ukraine, and if we take into account this nationalization trend, then how you reconcile nationalization with the Hegelian vision of state as the embodiment of zeitgeist? In case of Russia, it's like natural, it's evident. But what about Ukraine? Thank you.
Well, in Ukraine we have our own deep people and non-deep elites. And basically, in terms of nationalization, we are in a very strange situation. Recently I had a series of interviews. One category of interviews was done with young people, some of them soldiers or veterans, some of them wives of the soldiers, let's say. And for them, history starts 2014. Everything that was before, it wasn't Ukraine. So these 20 years of independence was, no, it wasn't us. And I was really like shocked. I didn't expect this result. Yes, in 2015, we see how a group of elites starts this radical nationalization, radical monopoly imposes, and it's a product. And there's another group of with whom I spoke. They are retired judges from upper courts. So really people who started, most of them, like out of 12, 10 out of 12 started their careers in Soviet Union. So they went through, all their careers went through the construction of Ukraine or flourishing of Ukraine of this, and then war period. And they know what they're talking about. And for them, real Ukraine that existed, it was in the 90s, where the freedom and nationalization in terms of freedom and democracy, and we made a good constitution, and we started like changing the court system, the judiciary, and so we could bring justice to these people. And then one of them, the oldest and who was at the top position in the court system of Ukraine, he said, you know, I'm looking back at these years, and I was forcing him to do it, so he was forced to look back. I said, probably the last time when I made a just decision was when he was a justice in Donetsk in '88, when he imprisoned some bad guy for doing hooligan actions. And after that, he said, I constantly had to make some concessions. And it was really scary for me. These two generations, where can they meet today? What is the platform? They are part of the same people, but what makes them to be together? And it's definitely not zeitgeist. Zeitgeist right now divides, not only Ukraine, it's in many other countries, but we are facing the need to start Ukrainian dialogue, and that's a very important mission.
We are approaching time, so we'll have one last question, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a great conversation. It's really deep and needed. I have also a conceptual question for the last, our chapter. So is this basically like, you know, in Jewish culture, in Torah, it's like some rules which build good person. So is in these countries, it's like good rules must build different, more European person, or its persons must change, as you mentioned, to build good rules. Because sometimes with reforms, like USA and other organizations, they push like good rules, but it's anyway like anti-corruption rules. But it's anyway not work well, because even new generation of people, like 30, 40 years old people who in government, they still play, even in war period, they still play post-Soviet Union game. Like they build KPSS in political parties and so on and so forth. So is it rules or must be better, or people must be different?
If I were a rabbi, I would answer you in a wise way. But being an Eastern European philosopher, I'll do my more humble response. Well, I don't know if everyone knows the case of Mr. Knyazov, who was the head of Supreme Court, who was elected after this new process into this position in 2021. So basically it was a pinnacle, the process when we had to produce finally the best of the best head of the Supreme Court. So justice embodied. So I followed the procedure, the process with many different deviations, but here I was looking how we together produce this embodied justice. It's not simply election of just another official. And then he is being caught having this huge pile of money, dividing it to other. So he wasn't even accepting a bribe, he was redistributing the bribes. And it was a huge hit for many reformists of my generation who really had huge expectations from these European type of events. So in a way, we have a set of rules, we try to implement them, and then we have patronal example, patronal result. So what's wrong? Maybe something is wrong, and I'm returning to Torah and Rabbi story to kind of also finish our event. You know, I think it was Marina Tsvetaeva's expression that the most important in the life was the thing that never happened. It was about to happen, but then something didn't let it be. That was in history of Ukraine back in 18th century, when at the same day, in the same place, there were two greatest brains of the era. Grigory Skovoroda, Ukrainian philosopher, young man at that time, almost heretic, and another almost heretic, greatest but already wise old man, Baal Shem Tov. They were in, I think it was Zbaraj, the Polish-Ukrainian town with the market. That was a privilege for the town. They were in the same place, same day, and they never met. So I think this is like a little pritcha to respond to you when something can happen but still doesn't happen, and we have to study what is it there that doesn't allow us, and I don't have the answer yet.
Oh, thank you, Misha. Let's please thank again.
Thank you.
This excellent presentation, and we're at time. We're actually a few minutes over, so I want to thank everyone that came today in person, thank our online audience, those excellent questions, and an excellent presentation. So we look forward to seeing everyone again next time.